August 19th, 1942. Dense jungle near Taivu Point, Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imai of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded observations in his diary that captured the shock many Japanese soldiers felt upon encountering American forces. Through the thick canopy of palm trees and strangling vines, Imai and 916 other soldiers of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment had just landed from destroyers, completing a nighttime insertion that Japanese command believed would be the first step toward recapturing Henderson Field. They had been told the Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men, poorly trained, easily frightened, soft from lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself had dismissed warnings to wait for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he told his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What none of these battle-hardened veterans of China and Southeast Asia knew was that they were about to encounter something unprecedented in the annals of the Imperial Japanese Army. Not merely defeat, which was itself unthinkable for soldiers who had known nothing but victory since 1937, but a systematic demolition of every tactical assumption, every strategic concept, every ideological certainty that defined the Japanese way of war. The jungle itself would become an American weapon. The darkness that Japanese forces had owned since the beginning of the war would betray them. And the overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and sheer destructive capability would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. The transformation had begun 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergrift's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Their objective seemed straightforward on paper. Seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield. Establish a defensive perimeter. Hold the position until relieved. In reality, they were about to fight the longest, most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history up to that point, in an environment that would test human endurance to its absolute limits. The island itself was a vision of tropical hell. Guadalcanal stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its interior dominated by mountains reaching 8,000 feet into perpetual clouds. The coastal plain where Henderson Field sat was a strip of kunai grass, swamp, and jungle, so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The heat was suffocating, humidity never dropping below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense that men inhaled them. The rivers and streams that looked clear and inviting on reconnaissance photographs teemed with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually disable more men than enemy action. But on that first morning, the Marines found the airfield almost undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops fled into the jungle, abandoning equipment, supplies, and most critically, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working to complete the runway. They would name it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would land, and the island would become home to what history would remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response was swift and catastrophic for American naval forces. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness in a brilliant surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in United States Navy history. 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra, were sent to the bottom in less than an hour. More than 1,000 sailors died in the flaming waters. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking with them most of the supplies that had not yet been unloaded. The Marines were stranded, cut off, facing a reinforced enemy with barely half their equipment and food. What the Japanese High Command failed to grasp in those early August days was that Henderson Field had become the key to everything. Control of the airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single fact would dictate the entire nature of the campaign. The Japanese could own the night, sending in troops and supplies aboard fast destroyers in runs that became known as the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke, American aircraft ruled the skies. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson Field immediately, before the Americans could fortify their position. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul. Hyakutake had only limited forces available. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam, originally intended for the Midway operation that had been cancelled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was an infantry school instructor with a reputation as a first-rate tactician. He was also known for being impulsive and having supreme confidence in Japanese fighting spirit over American material. Before departing Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received clear orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before attempting to retake the airfield. But Ichiki had very little respect for American soldiers. He had studied reports from China, from the Philippines, from everywhere Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. They lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They could not match Japanese warriors in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly, undetected by American forces. Ichiki immediately sent out reconnaissance patrols to assess enemy strength and defensive positions. It was a routine tactical decision that would prove fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they spotted Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief, vicious firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents that revealed the presence of a significant enemy force in the area. More importantly, the captured papers showed that the Japanese severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandergrift immediately understood what was coming. A Japanese attack. Soon. Probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defences along the sandbar at the mouth of what Marines called the Tenaru River. It was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification would stick in all subsequent accounts. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, with machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What happened next would become one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, rather than waiting for intelligence from his lost patrol or for reinforcements, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th into the early morning of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the superiority of spiritual power and aggressive night attacks to overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could break through American defenses through sheer audacity and close quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captors after hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines with a warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, hurling grenades. They ran directly into a killing zone the Marines had prepared with methodical precision. The M1917A 1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during World War I, were the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely as long as the water jacket stayed filled. The Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting positions, so that no area of the sandbar remained uncovered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who made it across the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that turned men into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the machine gun fire. Some made it to the Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, anything available. But the defensive preparations held. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, watching from a Marine position, described the scene. It was fascinating to see them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Approximately 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They would send a radio message to the 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ on how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colours and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed the shock of learning that an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans had not fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under night attack. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support that Marines could call upon exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy, and the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment, plus 500 naval marines. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one of the transports, Japanese command decided to abandon slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they would use destroyers for what became known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express worked brilliantly as a method of moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. But the method had a critical weakness: Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not just against American firepower, but against starvation itself. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal area. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps, indicating a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south, using the ridge as their approach route. Edson requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. General Vandergrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire. Mortar crews registered on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meters long, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and in some places impenetrable. It was the perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this was a more sophisticated attack. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. When they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage and confused. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. But the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Wauser, the same scout who had warned of the Tenaru attack, moved through the lines, encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi had more troops available and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Vandergrift sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in the machine gun fire.